He said it like a receipt slapped onto the table. I paid my dues as your father. The room went quiet after that, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I remember staring at the grain in the wood, my hands flat, steady in a way I didn't feel. Something inside me had already shifted, even before I answered. I could hear my own breath, slow and deliberate, as if my body was buying time my mind no longer had. When I finally looked up, my voice surprised me by how calm it sounded. "So this ends when you decide you're done paying?" The words hung there, heavier than I meant them to be. In that moment, I knew this wasn't just an argument. It was a line being drawn. And once it was crossed, there would be no pretending we could step back to who we were before. Before that night, my life had been defined by keeping things steady. I was the kind of man who believed that if you showed up, paid your bills, and didn't make trouble, things would eventually work themselves out. I grew up learning that from him. My father wasn't cruel in obvious ways. He didn't drink himself into rages or disappear for weeks at a time. He worked. He provided. He believed that was the whole contract. As a boy, I admired that. He woke up before dawn, came home tired, ate in near silence, and went to bed early. There was comfort in the predictability of it. My mother used to say, "Your father isn't much for words, but he's reliable." And for a long time, that felt like enough. I learned early not to ask for too much. No emotional explanations, no reassurance. If I needed something tangible, I could ask. If I needed understanding, I learned to handle that on my own. I carried that lesson into adulthood. I built a life that looked solid from the outside. A steady job, a marriage that lasted longer than most of my friends, children who grew up faster than I expected. Responsibility became my language. I told myself that love was proven through consistency, through showing up even when you were tired. In many ways, I modeled myself after him, believing that was how you avoided regret. But beneath that surface, there was always a quiet tension between us. Conversations stayed practical. We talked about work, about money, about repairs that needed doing. Anything personal drifted off unfinished, like a sentence neither of us wanted to complete. When disagreements came up, they were handled with silence rather than resolution. He had a way of ending discussions by simply withdrawing, and I learned, over time, to be the one who let things go. As he got older, the balance shifted. His certainty hardened. What once felt like discipline turned into something rigid, unyielding. He began to measure every relationship like an account ledger. What he'd given, what he was owed. I noticed it most when it came to family decisions. If something didn't align with his expectations, he treated it as a personal slight, something that invalidated all he'd done before. I told myself this was just aging, that it wasn't worth reopening old patterns. I had my own responsibilities now, my own children watching how I handled conflict, how I defined respect. I wanted to believe we could exist without challenging each other, that history alone would hold us together. But there were moments, quiet, unguarded ones, when I felt the weight of everything unsaid. Times when I realized that my need for his approval had never fully disappeared, only learned how to stay quiet. And somewhere deep down, I knew that silence was no longer neutral. It was costing something. Time, honesty, maybe even the chance to finally understand each other before it was too late. The incident itself wasn't dramatic from the outside. No shouting, no slammed doors. It started with a decision I made without asking him first. A practical one, I thought. Necessary. It involved my family, my time, and a responsibility I could no longer balance the way he expected me to. When I told him, I spoke carefully, choosing words that wouldn't provoke, the way I always had. I explained my reasons. I talked about limits. I said I couldn't keep doing things the old way. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back slightly, crossed his arms, and said, almost casually, "After everything I've done for you, this is what you choose?" There it was, that familiar tightening in my chest. The unspoken math. Years of work, years of provision, stacked neatly against a single choice that didn't align with his. I tried to stay grounded. I told him this wasn't about erasing the past. I said I was grateful. I said I knew what he'd sacrificed. But I also said that my life, at this stage, couldn't be governed by debts that never seemed to expire. That was when his expression changed. Not anger exactly, something colder, final. That's when he said it. "I paid my dues as your father." As if fatherhood had an end date. As if love was a shift you clocked out of once the work was done. The words landed harder than any insult could have. In that moment, I understood something I'd avoided for years. This wasn't just about this decision. It never had been. I realized that every compromise I'd made, every silence I'd chosen, had been built on the hope that one day he'd see me as more than an extension of his efforts. But sitting there, listening to him reduce our relationship to a completed obligation, I felt that hope finally give way. Something broke, not loudly, not visibly, but completely. That was the point of no return. Because once I heard him frame our bond as a closed account, I knew I could never again pretend that compliance was the same as connection. And I also knew that whatever came next would cost me something I couldn't get back. After that conversation, nothing immediately fell apart. That was almost worse. We went back to our routines with a new stiffness, like a hairline crack running through everything. Calls became shorter. Visits felt formal, scheduled, careful. I noticed myself rehearsing before speaking to him, editing my words mid-sentence, trying to avoid anything that might reopen what we'd left exposed. It was exhausting, carrying that awareness all the time. But the consequences kept surfacing anyway. Small things first. He stopped offering help unless I asked directly, and when he did help, there was an edge to it, a reminder attached, a comment about how things used to be done, a pause that invited guilt. I started to recognize the pattern more clearly than ever before. His support had always come with an expectation of alignment. The difference now was that I could no longer unsee it. Internally, I was unraveling in quieter ways. I found myself replaying memories I hadn't thought about in years. Moments when I'd swallowed disappointment, convinced myself I was being unreasonable. I realized how often I'd measured my own worth against his approval, even as an adult. That realization didn't come with relief. It came with shame. I was old enough to know better, yet still caught in a dynamic I'd inherited and never challenged. At the same time, my own children were watching me. Not directly, not consciously, but they noticed when I came back from seeing him more withdrawn than before. They noticed the way my patience thinned, how I carried tension into rooms that had nothing to do with him. That scared me. I didn't want to pass this on, the quiet trade of obedience for peace. I didn't want them to learn that love was something you earned by shrinking. I tried, one last time, to bridge the gap. I suggested we talk things through, really talk. He agreed, but the conversation circled the same territory. He spoke about sacrifice, about what he'd given up. I spoke about boundaries, about change. We weren't arguing. We were speaking different languages, each convinced the other was refusing to listen. When it ended, there was no resolution, only a mutual fatigue that settled in like dust. The pressure built not from confrontation, but from clarity. I began to understand that maintaining the relationship exactly as it was required me to keep paying a price I could finally name. It meant continuing to accept a version of love that had conditions I could no longer meet without losing something essential. And once I saw that clearly, the waiting became unbearable. Something had to give. The moment came quietly, which is how the most irreversible things seem to arrive. We were sitting across from each other again, not long after that last attempt to talk. Same table, same chairs, different air. He was explaining, again, why my decision had been selfish, how it dismissed everything he'd built, everything he believed he was owed. I listened longer than I meant to, longer than I should have. And then something inside me settled, heavy and still, like sediment finally reaching the bottom. I interrupted him, not sharply, just enough to stop the momentum. "I need you to hear me," I said. My hands were shaking, but my voice wasn't. That alone told me this was different. "I'm not doing this anymore. Not this version of us." He frowned, confused more than angry. That was new. I told him that I wasn't denying what he'd done as a father. I wasn't rewriting history, but I was done living as if my entire adulthood existed to validate his past. I said that love couldn't be something that expired the moment I made a choice he didn't like. I said that if being his son meant permanent debt, then that relationship would always require me to disappear in small ways. He leaned back, arms crossed, waiting for me to finish so he could respond. I saw then that he assumed this was still a negotiation, still a phase. That realization hurt more than anything he'd said. "So this ends when—" I paused, feeling the weight of the sentence before it fully formed. "When I keep paying for something that was never meant to be repaid." The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was empty. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply said, "If that's how you see it, then that's on you." And just like that, he stood up, as if the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Watching him walk away, I understood the choice I had just made. There would be consequences. Distance. Maybe permanent. I would lose the version of my father I'd been hoping would eventually show up. I would grieve someone who was still alive. But I also knew, with a clarity that frightened me, that staying would have cost me something I couldn't afford anymore. That was the moment. Not loud, not dramatic, just a decision finally spoken out loud, knowing there was no way to take it back. After that day, the relationship didn't explode. It thinned. That's the only honest word for it. The calls became rare, then ceremonial. Birthdays acknowledged with short messages. Holidays negotiated through other family members. There was no formal goodbye, no declaration of distance, just space, slowly doing what it always does, making things smaller, quieter, more permanent. At first, I carried a constant ache, the kind that sits just behind the sternum. I'd catch myself wanting to call him when something broke around the house, or when I needed advice I already knew how to follow. Those habits took time to unlearn. What surprised me was how much grief came with the relief. I wasn't just mourning the relationship we had, I was mourning the one I'd spent decades believing was still possible. There were nights I replayed that final conversation, wondering if I could have phrased something differently. Softer, smarter, more forgiving. But every version led back to the same truth. Clarity doesn't always come gently, and honesty doesn't always preserve comfort. I hadn't ended the relationship. I'd ended the illusion that endurance alone would transform it. What changed most was how I showed up in my own life. With my children, I became more deliberate, more present in ways that had nothing to do with providing. I learned to say things aloud that I'd once assumed were understood. Pride, regret, affection. I noticed how easily silence can be inherited, and how intentionally it has to be broken. That awareness didn't come without pain, but it came with responsibility. As for my father, I stopped waiting. That might have been the hardest part, letting go of the idea that time, patience, or one perfectly worded explanation would finally bridge the gap. I accepted that he might always see the story as one of ingratitude, and that I couldn't live my life trying to edit his version of events. Now, when I think of him, it's with a mixture of gratitude and distance. Both are true. He gave what he knew how to give. I stopped asking him for what he couldn't. That decision reshaped my understanding of love, not as something owed or earned, but as something that either grows with truth or collapses under conditions. This is a memory I carry carefully, not with bitterness, but with weight. Because some choices don't resolve neatly. They don't offer closure or reconciliation. They simply mark the moment you chose responsibility over familiarity, and honesty over hope. And once you make that choice, you don't move on from it. You move forward, knowing exactly what it cost and why you paid it.